Before day 11 of Denver Broncos training camp, the team made a shocking decision releasing safety Caden Sterns. We already had concerns about the safety position and the depth as is. We'll tell you why we're a little bit more concerned going into today's brand new episode, Locked On Broncos.
You are Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's happening, Broncos Country? Welcome to another episode of Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm Cody Roark, credentialed Broncos reporter here from Mile High Sports, joined alongside, as always, by site expert over there, predominantlyorange.com. He is Sayre Bedinger. And on today's show, day 11 of Broncos camp in the books. They're preparing for the NFL preseason. We'll talk about some of the standouts we saw here on day number 11. But on top of that, Inyoma Uwazurike reinstated by the NFL after missing a year due to gambling. What is Sean Payton looking for with his return? Bo Nix appears to be running away with the quarterback one job as training camp pushes forward. We'll tell you one stat we've seen that supports that notion that we have here, and a shocking release to open up the day right before practice. The Broncos making the announcement to move on from safety Caden Sterns, a surprising move that has us a little concerned about the team's overall depth at safety. We'll break all that down real quick. I want to say thanks once again to everybody in Broncos Country for being an everydayer here, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you so much for making us your first listen wherever you get your podcasts or available on YouTube. Sayre, really, I was pulling into Dove Valley for training camp Monday morning, and I get the notification on my phone from Tom Pelissero that the Broncos, they informed safety Caden Sterns of their plans to release him. And so I sat in there and I wrote an article in my car before practice because, like, well, this is, breaking news. I was surprised by it. I didn't expect this. A little bit of a shocker here, but Sean Payton gave us some insight as to why this decision happened, even if I don't necessarily agree with it right now.
Yeah, it was definitely a shocking move. I think that, honestly, a lot of people out there are probably kind of wondering, like, what the heck is going on with this move? Do the Broncos, are they going to bring back Justin Simmons? Do they really like the guys that they have on the roster right now? Because quite frankly, Brandon Jones, he ain't been practicing out there. He's got the hamstring injury. So I can understand why there's a lot of concern in Broncos Country. The cries for Justin Simmons to get off the driving range a couple miles away from the facility and come play for the team again are getting louder and louder. But the shock of Caden Sterns is more so the story than anything else right here, because we had just gotten done talking about Sean Payton say, well, he's ramping up, getting ready to get back on the practice field, and they're kind of just monitoring each step as he was coming back from the injury that he suffered last year. It just unfortunately seems like, availability versus lack of availability is what it's coming down to with Caden Sterns and the Denver Broncos. And even with question marks at the safety position, I think you and I were optimistic that if everybody could stay healthy, this had a potential to be an upside position for the team. But now Caden Sterns is out of the mix. So it's like, what the heck is next for the Denver Broncos at this position?
I have no idea, right? That's the question that I think we all kind of have in our head, because I think when you look at Caden, we've talked about it, Broncos Country, you've certainly seen it. When Caden is healthy, he can be a playmaker for you defensively as a ball hawk against the run. You can set him on pressure. He can get after the quarterback. Like, he has a skill set that's very unique. And I think there's the timing is a little interesting here, but I think Sean Payton gave us clarity. I asked Sean following practice what factored into the decision, that was made to release Caden. And he told us that really it was because of, they feel very comfortable with the depth. Like, we don't feel necessarily comfortable with the depth, but the coaching staff, Sean Payton, feels comfortable with the depth and the guys that are, right there. And look, it's not just J.L. Skinner, Devin Key. It's also guys like Tanner McAllister, Keidron Smith getting involved in the mix, Omar Brown. So they have a lot of young guys at this position. For me, the concern is not necessarily the number of guys that they have here, Sayre, factoring in the injury to Brandon Jones. My biggest concern is the fact that you just have a lot of young guys that you don't know what they're going to bring to the table just yet in actual game situations. And granted, we're going to get our first look at these guys in the preseason coming up this Sunday.
And I think that that's a huge part of it. What you just said is that they really want to see these guys on the field and in game situations. I think that's the case for a lot of different positions on this roster right now, where people in the fan base have questions. I mean, the quarterback position borderline seems, done, and that's like the book is closed on that one as compared to some of these other spots where we're talking about tight end, we're talking about safety, cornerback, linebacker. I mean, there's so many other position groups that's like, okay, the fan base has kind of planted the flag in the ground of saying, we don't know what to expect here. And the coaching staff has planted their flag in the ground of saying, we're telling you, we like this guy, or we like these guys at this position group. And at safety, that is the toughest pill to swallow because of the guy that you let go. I think that for the fan base, with Justin Simmons' departure, the fact that he's still a free agent, I know that, hey, whether or not it's realistic for Justin to come back to the Denver Broncos is irrelevant at this point. Now you've put yourself in a position by cutting Sterns, by cutting Justin Simmons, you've put yourself in a position as the organization that your young guys and Brandon Jones, they better step up at this position group, or else everybody is going to be absolutely roasting you throughout the course of the season for not making a change when you have the chance. We're seeing the Tennessee Titans. They've gone after 2 veterans. The Baltimore Ravens, they signed Eddie Jackson. There's still a lot of other safeties available in free agency right now. It just doesn't feel like, I almost texted you this morning when the news came through, Cody, it almost feels less likely that Justin Simmons will come back now, because cutting Caden Sterns sends such a message of confidence in the other guys that are on the team, in my opinion. I know Sterns wasn't a projected starter. That's PJ Locke and Brandon Jones. But I thought he was going to play a big role this season. The fact that he's cut, as Sean Payton is saying, hey, we want to get to the right 53-man roster. The fact that they cut Caden Sterns now at this stage of the offseason, that speaks volumes to this whole situation.
And I think that's where it's kind of hard to be like, wait a minute, you have all these players on your roster. That's the first move that you made at a position where it's like you probably have more overall question marks here. And look, on top of that as well, this is where my concern is just watching practice. Well, I've liked what I've seen from JL Skinner, Devin Key. I mean, Sayre, let's think, okay, Brandon Jones is out here. Let's say he comes back. If he or PJ get injured at any point of the season, that to me is a little bit of a concern, because it's like, all right, we already have visual evidence in the last year of what the Broncos back into the secondary looks like when Justin Simmons is not on the field. So you make the decision to release him. You go out, you sign Brandon Jones, who I think could be a terrific player, but he's dealing with an injury right now. PJ Locke, rewarded a well-deserved contract extension. If any of these guys miss, all of a sudden, I'm hitting a little bit of the panic button here on that safety position, just because it's like you don't know truly what you have there. And look, this is the gamble, right? I think this is for the Broncos, they're making a gambling type of decision here about like the roster and their confidence in young guys. And look, I understand you got to get young guys reps. You got to see it. But if this ends up backfiring, there will be a lot of scrutiny that comes, the direction of the franchise. Payton and George Payton, both those guys are going to get a lot of criticism, because you need production at the safety position. We saw Justin's value last year. We saw exactly what it looked like without him. And now you're kind of playing with fire a little bit, hoping not to get burnt at this position. So Broncos country, as always, we want to know how you feel about the Broncos safety position following the release of Caden Sterns on Monday morning. Certainly a shock for us here on the show, but we got some other things to talk about as the Broncos wrapped up day 11 of training camp at Broncos Park, powered by Common Spirit. And the Broncos quarterback one job feels like Bo Nix is running away with it. We'll talk about one stat that shows exactly why, and we'll discuss it here on today's episode of the show. This episode is brought to you by BetterHelp. And when your schedule is packed with kids' activities, big work projects, and more, it's easy to let your priorities slip. Even when we know what makes us happy, it's hard to make time for it. But when you feel like you have no time for yourself, non-negotiables like therapy are more important than ever before. And that's where BetterHelp can come into the equation here. I've used BetterHelp therapy before in the past to help deal with stress, anxiety, amongst other things. And I loved how easy it was to sign up. I filled out a brief questionnaire. I matched with a therapist within minutes, scheduled my first session. My therapist and I hit it off really well. So I was able to keep maintaining and building sessions there. But if you don't vibe well with your therapist, the one thing I also like about it, they allow you to change therapists at any time at no additional charge to yourself. And so make sure you stay in the game of taking care of yourself and staying in the game. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online. It's designed to be convenient, flexible, and best of all, suited to your schedule to meet you where you're at. Never skip therapy day with BetterHelp. That's BetterHelp.com. betterhelp.com/lockedon today to get 10% off your first month. Once again, that's betterhelp.com/lockedon. That's betterhelp, HELP.com/lockedon.
There's one big reason why it feels like Bo Nix is about to wrap up the quarterback one competition in Denver. And we're going to talk about that on today's episode of Locked On Broncos, but want to say thank you to every single one of you that makes us your first listen of the day every single day. And hey, for all of you fantasy football players out there, for your second listen of the day, you need to go check out Locked On Fantasy Football. I know I need to get ready for my one draft of the year, Cody, so got to check out what the experts are saying over there, because I consider myself to be an absolutely horrible fantasy football player. So got to get educated here, and I know a lot of you are in the same boat. But of course, I'll probably be that guy to draft Bo Nix on my fantasy team because, I got to manifest it somehow. He's got to be the starter, though, in order to get drafted in fantasy football, right? But I think there is one particular piece of I don't know if you just want to call it a stat. It is kind of a stat, right? It's something that we've been observing and keeping track of over the last week. There's one major reason why I think Bo has all but wrapped up this quarterback competition, Cody, and it really deals with just the reps that he's taking at practice.
Well, he's received first-team reps with the first-team offense in 5 of the last 7 practices, including Monday's practice. And look, we saw it initially. Like, there's been a heavy emphasis. I know Saturdays was kind of skewed a little bit just because Jarrett Stidham in the first-team period got the first-team reps, but then the next 2 team periods, it was Bo Nix getting the first-team reps. So part of me saying, okay, you're seeing a little bit of a larger volume here with Bo. I think everything is setting up here because of that. 5 practices with the first team offense in the last 7. And now you're building up for a preseason game. And what Sean Payton says, Tuesday or Wednesday, they'll more than likely have it in their heads as to who's going to start, who's going to get the first reps at not just QB, but every position. And I'm very curious to see how that pans out. But I mean, Sayre, if you're reading the tea leaves, if we're looking at what we're seeing at practice, there is a concerted effort to give Bo every opportunity to be the guy. And it seems like he's making steady growth, which once again, I'll say in Monday's practice, I thought Bo had a very, very solid day operating the offense. I'm sure some of you have seen the clips that are posted a little bit on social media, but finding Cortland Sutton and some team period stuff, Bo is starting to make, I say a lot of progress in terms of his comfortability, but it's also leading to visible results in some of these team periods.
And we heard Jaleel McLaughlin after Monday's practice talk about how Bo is out there teaching him stuff. I know that Bo is an older rookie, and if not for Brandon Weeden, the outlier of outliers, Bo would be the oldest first-round quarterback ever drafted. So it's not altogether surprising that he's got such an expanded knowledge of the game compared to where you expect rookies to be at. But you've got Jaleel McLaughlin telling him he's teaching him stuff about running routes out of the backfield and things like that. And I just find he's so impressive to me, Cody. When I see the clips at practice, you see the adjustments that he's making at the line of scrimmage. You see the execution of the offense. You see that he's willing to take off and run when given opportunities. He looks like he's seeing the field extremely well. He's not making mistakes with the ball. You could, a lot of times at Broncos camp in years past, you might have to kind of talk yourself into, well, was that throw behind, or would he have gotten sacked in a real game? Things like that. There's no talking yourself into stuff at what I'm seeing, and I'm sure from what you're seeing as well. So I think when it comes to this competition, we didn't want it to be contrived, right? We didn't want it to be something that was like, well, Sean Payton is saying there's a competition and he's out there taking away reps from Bo Nix. Does it feel to you like he's doing that? To me, it doesn't necessarily feel like he's taking reps from Nix in order to continue to perpetuate this, so to speak, competition. It feels like Bo is just taking advantage of his opportunities, and the Broncos do seem to be kind of prioritizing him ahead of this game against the Colts.
Well, and look, I hate to kind of like try to, make a point here by saying, hey, 2 + 2 = 4 in this situation. But the way also Sean Payton has also talked about Bo Nix gives the vibes that, hey, like the focus is on Nix. And look, I think from an organizational aspect here, the team's focus is definitely on Bo Nix being the starting quarterback. I mean, you come up with new jerseys, you want to have like clarity. Like there was a situation where Zach Wilson was on the team before Bo was, but Zach was wearing number 10. And all of a sudden now you draft a guy first round overall, and now you give the rookie number 10 and Zach Wilson changes to number 4. I mean, there are all signs point to the alignment being like, hey, Bo Nix is going to be the face of our franchise, at least on the offensive side of the ball for the quarterback. Now, going to some of the big throws and big plays that we saw during, the various team periods. In team period 1, he found Greg Dulcich for a nice underneath route, crossing route, yards after the catch, about maybe 7 or 8 yards up there. On the third play of the first team period, he dropped back and there was pressure. Nobody was open though. And so what he did, he understood and he knew when to tuck it and run. He scrambled for 10 plus yards. I think his mobility aspect is definitely going to be something that gets talked about quite a bit this upcoming season. I think you're going to see a little bit more of it. If you watched him at Oregon, he's very mobile, can do a lot of things on the run. The second team period series, this is probably the best overall series from him, sir, because one thing we saw was it was a third down emphasis, right? Third and short, third and medium, third and long. He had a screenplay to Javonte early on. Javonte dropped it. It was incomplete there. But on the very next play, he finds Cortland Sutton on an in-breaking route for about 10 to 12 yards. There was one play as well where he drops back. He's scanning the field looking for a receiver. Good coverage by the defense. So you know what it turns into? Scramble drill. He did a really good job rolling out to his right. Little Jordan Humphrey did a good job coming back to the football, catching about maybe 7 to 10 yards there. But on the final play of the second team period series, Nix fired an absolute laser of a shot to Cortland Sutton about 20 to 23 yards downfield, right in between the corner and the safety. And it's like, all right. At that point, some of us in the media tent, I remember looking over at Henry Chisholm of DNVR, Andrew Mason. We were all sitting there talking. It's like, all right, this is all Bo. Like, this is the Bo show now. It certainly feels that way based on what we talked about in terms of the stat, but also what he's doing on the practice field.
Yeah, and to me, that's where he really is separating himself, because you and I talked about this going into training camp, that if Jarrett Stidham was going to win the job, it wasn't necessarily going to be all right, well, Jarrett had, 16 really great practices and Bo had only 14. So Jarrett Stidham is obviously the starter. No, you and I both, I think, agree. And certainly if Bo Nix is practicing really well, I mean, that to me is the number one indicator. You're giving him all the reps. He's practicing well. And I don't say all the reps as a literal thing. I understand that he's not getting literally all of them, but goodness sakes, Cody, I think going into this Colts game, we heard Sean Payton talk after practice. They kind of want to have a lineup decided by Wednesday. I would not be shocked at all if we get the announcement at some point by then or before then.
We were even sitting there as well. Like, why at this point, why wait to announce who your starting quarterback is? I mean, I understand that there's going to be, if you announce it now, they're going to be, okay, week 1, Seattle. They're going to be watching every game in the preseason. They're going to be watching every Bo Nix snap, which I imagine they're going to already be doing that. But if you announce a starter, it means you don't have to watch the other quarterbacks necessarily, so to speak. Like, if you don't announce who's the starter, the Seattle's going to be watching Jarrett Stidham tape. They're going to be watching Bo Nix tape primarily between those two guys. I mean, I understand that. But at this point, if it's Bo, just come out and say it, because you know what you're going to do. You're going to align everything around him. Look at CJ Stroud last year. Like, they still had Davis Mills on the team, and CJ Stroud got the first reps with them in terms of what they were doing offensively in the preseason. And, he threw a pick in the preseason. He didn't have the best stat lines in the preseason. And I remember everyone's like, oh, he's a bust. And then what does he do? He goes out and lights it up. Not saying that Bo's going to do that, but it's just like, put your plan in place now so you can be as ready as you can as you start to assemble your 53-man roster before the Seattle game. Why wait? Just get it on with, announce who the starter is. And then now I think you can focus a little bit more on your concerted effort. Like, hey, we're going into joint practices knowing that, hey, Bo's the starter. We're going to do this to build these packages around him, because they're still going through install, but there are some other stuff, to be continued in terms of what's going on there. So we'll see how it all plays out here. And obviously watch Sean Payton throw a little bit of wrench. Watch us go to Tuesday's practice, and all of a sudden Zach Wilson's getting reps with the first team offense. Sean's a funny guy like that. I could see him doing that. But, I mean, all signs. And I think just what we've observed at practice with the number of practices he's gotten with the first team offense in the last 7 days, 7 practices, that speaks volumes. I mean, it screams from the mountaintops that, hey, Bo is the guy. And look, Broncos country, even if he makes mistakes, you're going to have to let Bo go through those growing pains. You're going to have to let him go through the process. If he makes a mistake, it's not the end of the world just because he throws an interception. Even if he has a 2 interception game, it doesn't mean that he's a bust. You have to let the process play out and obviously let these guys continue to grow and fall forward. But it seems like Bo is the guy for the Broncos going forward. And look, as we continue diving a little bit deeper on today's episode of the show, the 2022 NFL draft class, it's finally looking up after a rough couple of seasons, a rough couple of first years there. 2 key pieces of the defense from that draft class were back on the practice field on Monday. You'll get that coming up next. Locked On Broncos. Today's episode of the show is brought to you by our friends over there at FanDuel Sportsbook, and NFL preseason is officially here, and Broncos Country now is your chance to get in on the action over on FanDuel Sportsbook as summer winds down and sports starts up once again. Major League Baseball right now is in full swing, but you know what we're excited about? We're excited about the NFL preseason, and the Denver Broncos play the Indianapolis Colts this Sunday on the road. The Broncos are considered right now 1.5-point road underdogs. We don't know who's going to start at quarterback just yet, who's going to get work with the starters, but we are intrigued by the preseason. And FanDuel, they love the preseason, so make sure you get in on the action. Check it out here today and get involved with some of the bonuses because they're hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily, every day, for everyone, all summer long. So head over to FanDuel.com and start making the most out of your summer. Once again, that's FanDuel.com. FanDuel is the official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball and the National Football League. As we jump to the fourth quarter action on today's episode, Locked On Broncos, a little bit of a highlight here for the 2022 NFL draft class with two defensive players from that unit returning back to the practice field. We'll break it all down here on today's episode of the show. Real quick, I want to say once again, thank you so much, Broncos Country, for making us your first listen. Make sure you subscribe or follow the podcast wherever you get your podcasts or on YouTube. Going to that 2022 NFL draft class, Sayre, really the first draft that the Broncos had significantly less draft capital than anybody had hoped for. You saw them go on a little bit. Okay, Nick Bonito, a late round 2 pick, and then Inyoma Uwazurike a little bit later, adding to the defensive line there. Both players back on the practice field. But really the biggest story here, outside of Bonito coming back from a back injury, Inyoma Uwazurike officially reinstated by the National Football League.
Yes, just coincidence that these two guys came back onto the field the same day, but I think kind of a nice coincidence for us to be able to kind of talk about that 2022 draft class because Inyoma Uwazurike has a chance to be a factor on this team. I know they want to ramp him up a little bit slowly here, but just the way that Sean Payton has been kind of talking about him, the fact that the Broncos didn't cut him when they probably easily could have justified doing so a year ago at this time. I find it pretty interesting that he's being welcomed back. He even got his old jersey number back and everything. So there's no, he's kind of picking up where he left off. And I think that where he left off last year, a year ago at this time, I believe he was in line to be a starting defensive end for the Broncos. And I think that his suspension not only caught them off guard, but really put a wrench in the entire defensive line for last season, where we saw Jonathan Harris start, we saw Mike Purcell play, we saw Matt Henningsen play extensive snaps. I don't know that any of those guys, obviously we know Purcell won't be and Jonathan Harris won't be. I don't know if Matt Henningsen will be playing for the Broncos this year. It's going to be a very different looking group, but Uwazurike now being one of your 5 or 6 guys, I mean, that unit has already been upgraded, but getting this guy back, another 300+ pounder with long arms, can get his hands up there and bat passes or block kicks. I mean, it's exciting to have him back on the field, even if it's just a wild card option as of right now.
And it's going to be very interesting to see how fast he comes along, right? You know, when you don't do anything football related for an entire year, there's going to be questions about, you know, how well were you staying in shape? How well were you, you know, following, you know, a regimen to keep your diet, you know, where it needs to be? What did you do to maintain strength or get stronger? Like, I'm sure Uwazurike probably spent a lot of time in the gym, but there was a lot of self-work that he had to do. And obviously there's a lot of conditions that he has to face and continue to do in terms of his reinstatement by the National Football League in order to continue to be in the NFL. There's a lot of work and a lot of, I think, not community service, so to speak, but in the NFL form, a lot of education and a lot of just guidance, I think, and a lot of monitoring throughout this year for a guy like Inyoma Uwazurike. But obviously he's going to be factored into the equation here. And obviously as we're doing the show, we just get word here from Mike Kliss. No trade for Caden Sterns. The NFL wire deadline officially passed, and so now he has officially been waived. We'll be able to, I think at this point, I'm trying to think how many years he is. If he's, he's 2021 draft. So, yeah, interesting. So I don't know if it applies to him. I think he has to be there has to be a claim on him. If not, he'll more than likely be able to sign with any other team. Sometimes it's hard to figure out the vetting process here for the National Football League in terms of the release. There's so many damn rules, Sayre. Drives me up a wall. I don't know everything. So, but with that said, just a step in the right direction. Obviously, we're hoping for him. He can acclimate and be able to play in a preseason game. That's the biggest question. We don't know when that's going to be. But maybe let's shift gears here a little bit to Nick Bonito returning from the back injury, same guy in that draft class, took a big step last year. It was good to see him back, but he's been dealing with some back issues. And so I'm very curious to see how he holds up this week, because he returned last week for one day and then was back on the shelf. So a little bit of concern there, but you're getting more looks at guys like Jonah Ellis and even Jalen Allen and Thomas Incoom. Like, there's some really good competition at that position right now.
There is, and just because Nick Bonito was back at practice on Monday, I don't think necessarily means that we're going to see a lot of him on the field against the Indianapolis Colts. I mean, I don't even know if we should expect him to play at all based on the fact of his, recent weeks of practice. So I would say it's another opportunity for that edge group, especially Thomas Incoom, who you've mentioned a number of times on this show, and we've looked over your notes. I've seen people say he's maybe averaging about a sack a day out there at practice, and so really looking forward to seeing what he can do against the Indianapolis Colts. And I do think that's one of the more interesting position groups every preseason. I've mentioned that before, but I think that's something worth watching. Let's talk about a couple of other young players, Cody, who have been stepping up at practice. Chris Abrams-Draine, we mentioned him on yesterday's episode of the show as we were kind of recapping the rookie class. Sean Payton kind of noted after practice the vision for him is an outside-in corner. Sounds like he's been out there making plays in the defensive backfield.
Yeah, and particularly, they did one-on-ones. I love when they do one-on-ones because it's a competitive period. Instead of just doing one-on-ones, where you have a long field behind you, they condensed the field a little bit. So you saw like the Broncos working in from maybe the 30-yard line in, and then you saw them working from the 5-yard line in, some goal line red zone situations where, you get one-on-one looks. And I thought Abrams-Draine did a really good job getting in phase, playing patient. There were a couple reps he had against Lil Jordan Humphrey where Lil Jordan Humphrey, he runs a fade route. I thought Abrams-Draine, me, I'm a former cornerback. I'm watching technique, did a great job getting into Lil Jordan Humphrey's hip pocket, having his hand there, but also being disciplined to not look back just to look, but also just timing it. Like, he's looking at Lil Jordan Humphrey. When Lil Jordan Humphrey looks back, DBs are usually told, like, hey, when he looks back, you can look back. He kind of did that, but then he followed the ball through the air and he looked at Lil Jordan Humphrey's hands because the ball is placed high to the outside, and he just made a play through the hands, knocking the football away. Technically, he moved really well, had some good reps in one-on-ones, had some plays during the team period, but he's obviously gaining a lot more confidence as that cornerback room in that battle kind of plays itself out a little bit, which is interesting considering now Levi Wallace, no official timeline on him yet, but he's got a hamstring alongside Brandon Jones. We'll see what the prognosis is, how long Wallace will be out, but it opens up the door for Damari Mathis and Riley Moss to get more reps, and now maybe even more looks at Chris Abrams-Draine, which I thought, was an impressive look for him. But even on the offensive line, Mike McGlinchey was the one guy who was not at practice on Monday. He and his wife are expecting, or just had a baby, and he's expected to be back for Tuesday. There's a big reason why Big Mike wasn't in the lineup, but somebody else was.
Yeah, big congrats to Mike McGlinchey and his family as well for that. But Alex Palczewski got an opportunity to be out there with the #1 offensive line, which I think we were all kind of interested to know with Quinn Bailey going down with a season-ending injury. We've seen Matt Peart out there getting reps at left tackle when Garrett Bowles was kind of rotating out. Now Alex Palczewski at right tackle, where I think he's ascended into a guy that the Broncos are going to prioritize. So if you're putting together 53-man roster predictions out there, I'd probably put Alex Palczewski on there. Sean Payton said after practice that they really believe right tackle is his home. Sean Payton came just a little bit shy of saying he's not athletic enough to play left tackle. He didn't say that deliberately, but I think you kind of got the implication he makes up for his athleticism with just a lot of experience, playing smart. And Sean Payton said that when the pads come on, he becomes exactly the type of player that he needs to be. When you're talking about, well, this guy lacks the athletic traits here. Well, Palczewski has played a lot of football and he's very smart. And Sean Payton noted that he's a very smart player. So I think that's a guy that we can probably expect to be the #1 swing tackle at this point. That would be my expectation, Cody. Maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that would be exciting to have a developmental tackle who's the coaching staff is that high on.
Yeah, and look, if you go with your jumbo package where it's like, hey, whoever's reported as eligible, you're going to see number 63 now. It's getting more than likely we've seen Quinn Bailey come in and play on that right side as the extra guy. I don't know why the right side could be left at times, but I mean, why ask a guy to do something as a coach he's not necessarily good at? And I think Sean is very aware of what his players are and aren't good at. He knows what situations to put them in, what situations to avoid putting them in. And I think that's something that we'll continue to see. I think the biggest thing for me the rest of this week in practice and in the first preseason game, how he uses these guys in what order, and maybe their visions become a little bit clearer to us when that happens. But look, Broncos Country, thank you so much for tuning into today's episode. Locked On Broncos, free and available everywhere you get your podcast or available on YouTube. Make sure you subscribe or follow so you never miss out on what's going on. Thank you so much for making Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day, becoming an everydayer here, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. On top of that, though, for you making us your first listen of the day, for your second listen, don't forget to go check out the Locked On Fantasy Football Podcast as some of your drafts are starting up. Go check out Vinny Iyer and the experts and what they have going on over there, Locked On Fantasy Football. For all you everydayers, here's tomorrow's episode of the show. Day 12 of Broncos camp will happen, obviously, Tuesday morning following practice. Sayre Bedinger, myself, we'll sit down. We'll discuss what we saw and any other news and developments, plus standouts that we have seen at practice. You're going to get that much more tomorrow.